economic scale from the church with the Tudor Poor Laws to the state was something that was happening with various acts with names like the Madhouse Act and the Lunatic Act, and then by the Edwardian period, the Mental Deficiencies Act. And so you've got asylums emerging as a way of treating or dealing with, hiding people deemed unworthy. And then Galton just drops into this, parachutes into this world. He's Charles Darwin's half cousin. And Darwin in 1859 describes evolution by natural selection. Doesn't talk about humans at all. Darwin is a extraordinarily liberal man for extremely wealthy, privileged man in 19th century Britain. But his cousin is Francis Galton, who is awful, extraordinarily bright, cannot see past his own prejudices, travels around the world, writes a best-selling travel book based on his travels around Africa, comes back as an extreme white supremacist. And he applies the ideas that are sort of set up about evolution by his cousin, who he adores and venerates, and believes that genius is a biological category that flows through his family.
And it seems whenever someone goes, genius is an inherited trait, no one ever goes, and it's not in my family. They go, and it is in my family. Yeah,
no, that's exactly right. And this is an example of him not being able to see past his own biases. His first book in this sort of area is called Hereditary Genius. And it is a very methodological, statistical analysis of the great men of British history. Prime ministers, MPs, poets, does include poets.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. Lawyers and various people. He's absolutely uninterested in women at all. And the difference with with this book and the significance of this book is that it is a scientific, a statistical, numerical application to great man theory of history, this very Whiggish view. Now, the stats are terrible, but it's sort of foundational in a scientific understanding of hereditary behaviors.
And what role does race play in this? Because one of the things I've been writing about recently is trying to sort of put together like a little potted history of race, going, how does this emerge as a technology of governance, and how does it change through the 19th century? And one of the things which I found extraordinary is that you couldn't separate racist discourses and ideas from ableist discourses and ideas and classist discourses and ideas. They were all sort of seen as part of the same thing, which is there are certain kinds of human who are deficient or inadequate or inherently stupid, and these are inherited characteristics that are passed down through generation, and that's got nothing to do with the fact that from generation to generation you've enslaved people or kept them poor or denied them education or treated them horribly.
Yes, exactly. These characteristics are immutable, and race science is almost uncontested at this time in Britain and in Europe and America as a result. The racial categories are fixed and they are immutable. And they are inherently hierarchical. So the classification system that we have rejected in science in the 20th century, because the evidence stacks up against it, is the foundation of biology. It's designed by Linnaeus in the late 18th century, in which he describes, he's the first person, not absolutely, but the first significant person to describe the different types of humans from around the world. 4 of them he starts off with and moves up to 5 with an extra category in a later edition of his big book, Systema Naturae. And the categorizations are initially a biological, a physical characteristic, skin color. Mm-hmm. Secondly, another one, hair color and texture. And then the next ones after that are unequivocal value judgments. I mean, extraordinarily racist. They're racist to us now. They're racist in their day as well because they're hierarchical. So sub-Saharan African people have silky black skin, tight curly hair, are lazy, capricious, physically strong, and sexually loose, right? Homo sapiens asiaticus, so broadly what we would refer to as East Asian today, are yellow-skinned. These are the words that he uses. Straight black hair, haughty, unimaginative, governed by tradition. Homo sapiens americanus, so indigenous Americans.
Not George W. Bush, which is where my brain went immediately.
No, definitely not him. So Native Americans, indigenous Americans. Straight black hair, red skin, governed by customs, blah, blah, blah. And he comes up with these four categories, and then the Homo sapiens europaeus are white-skinned with blue eyes, and they are creative, imaginative, graceful, and industrious. And this is the setup for biology. This is the origin of biology. Everyone that comes after him has another crack at it. Introduces new metrics like you alluded to, skull measurements or those sorts of things. But there isn't a single example of categorizations of humans between the 17th and 20th century which isn't hierarchical and doesn't put white Europeans as superior.
So what does the study of genetics then tell us about these categories? Because, of course, some of these are inherited traits. Skin tone's an inherited trait. I share mine with my mum. Eye colour, hair texture. How do these... what's the word? Phenotypes?
Phenotypes, yeah.
Yes. How do these phenotypes overlap with geography? Because that's the thing that's being described, is that these clusters of characteristics overlap with places in the world.
Yeah, that's right. And it's really important to recognize that people are different from around the world. Because I think one of the mistakes that well-intentioned anti-racist people have made in history is to adopt a sort of blank slate view that everyone is the same. And I think the reason that becomes such a problematic argument and inflames people who maybe aren't overt Nazis or actual racists is that we are very visual organisms, and we look and see people are different from around the world and have different physical characteristics. What genetics did in the 20th century is genetics is the real metric of human similarities and difference, because it is what is different at a molecular level rather than what is physical. And it influences what is physical, of course. But what we began to see is that the categorizations that had been used, initially using these very crude phenotypes like skin color, and then as they became more detailed, things like skull measurements and various things like that, is that they didn't correspond to the underlying genetic variation that we see around the world. In broad scale, they sort of do. We see continental clustering of I mean, it's difficult to talk about this without getting into some chewy maths, and I won't do that. But clustering is a real mathematical way of trying to identify things that are similar and things that are different. But what we find is that there are some broad similarities around the world in terms of genetic clustering, and largely, very broadly, they correspond to continental land masses. But beyond that, the way we talk about race does not correspond with genetic variability.
I mean, this is going to sound really thick, but I went to Mexico on holiday last year, and it was amazing. But I went to Mexico on holiday, and I was traveling around in the South, and I kept walking into people who looked just like me. So same skin tone, same hair texture. The thing that was different is that they tended to have more aquiline noses rather than squidgy Bengali ones. But I was walking down the road in San Cristobal, and I literally collided with a man who was the dead spit of my uncle. Dead spit. And I gawped at this poor guy, and he was like, "Is this girl okay?" And one of the things that taught me in just a really concrete way is that, yes, you've got these clusterings, but as far as I know, I have no indigenous Mexican heritage whatsoever. It's, Bengali as far back as we cared to record it. So this racial distinction of dark skin, dark straight hair, brown eyes, short, it was spanning continents.
Yeah, well, you can. I mean, there are undoubtedly physical similarities between people around the world in different phenotypes and different physical traits. that doesn't necessarily mean they have the same shared genetic origin. So this is an idea which is broadly sort of, we could call it convergent evolution, right? The straightness and darkness of your hair, bearing in mind the overall similarity between all.
So you're assuming
hair,
it's natural, but
that's
great wig.
That's straight black.
Okay, that's straight black.
Might be completely different from the straightness and blackness of hair from someone from East Asia, or from someone who's of Native American or indigenous American descent. I don't know that, but I'm quite happy to say that, and because that sort of variation.
Get furious hairdressers in the comments being like, actually,
but they get furious about anything though. They get so angry about things that are intuitively what they don't think is true, or they do think is true that I'm countering. This is the point that we were talking about earlier. It's that experiential thing that, like, the example I sometimes give is that I know you said you dropped biology as soon as you could, but do you remember eye color?
Yes, I remember eye color.
Okay, because that's how we teach genetics.
Okay.
Yeah? There's a gene which, if you have the brown version of the gene, it's dominant over the blue version.
That's what I hear. Right?
And if you've got one copy of the brown, then you'll have brown eyes.
Win.
Yeah? And you have to have two copies of the blue-eyed version to have blue eyes, right? Mm-hmm. You've just passed GCSE biology.
Why do so many Iranians have green eyes?
Well, because what I just said is not true. Right? Because it's incorrect.
Okay.
And it is the foundation of how we teach genetics. Incidentally, that model was invented by the American chief eugenicist in 1907, a guy called Charles Davenport, who was the American version of Francis Galton. And he was obsessed with the notion that everything, whether it's eye color or hair color or skin color, but also crazy behavioral traits like seafaringness or sexual proclivities or prostitution, all of these things that for him they worked in exactly the same way as eye color genetics does. And you just pointed out by saying that Iranian thing about green eyes, what the problem with it is. There aren't two eye colors. There isn't one gene which dominates the control of eye colors. There are at least 15. There's a third gene. So there's the blue and brown version of the same gene. There's also a green gene which it heavily influences green eyes. And the truth of the matter is that the model I just described, the Mendelian view of genetics, is more like a guideline.
I mean, so let's say, I hate to break it to you. I mean, we're all going to die, and it's going to happen to you one day too. But, the archaeologists of the future, they dig you up and they test your DNA. Would they be able to accurately put together how you would have looked? Because one of the things that the internet racists love to say to me is, well, you say you're English, but when you die and they dig you up, they'll be able to say that you weren't because they tested you genetically.
Well, if you die with your passport on you, then that's the end of that question.
If I die with like the lyrics to England Till I Die in my back pocket, I don't know.
This is the thing that the internet racists don't get, which is that these things, nationality is a social construct, right? Borders are social constructs. You're English because you have an English. You were born in. Were you born in England?
I was.
Well, then you're English.
And more to the point, I'm English because I'm emotionally repressed.
I can't comment on that, although I'm sure there's a genetic component to it. But this is the sort of central pillar of all of my work about eugenics and race. It's really the question of how scientific ideas get marshaled into pre-existing political ideologies. There's a lot of work in this domain within the history of science and within history and within sociology, but I'm trying to approach it from the point of view of a geneticist, of a scientist, because that's what we've talked about. We've talked about the history of the birth of scientific racism. We've talked about the birth of eugenics. But in both examples, this is scientists or proto-scientists making new discoveries or making new pronouncements, because I think in both cases they're not really very good science. And then the political classes, of which most of these guys are members anyway, use those new discoveries or those new pronouncements in order to justify their own pre-existing beliefs. So the phrase I use in talking about eugenics is that it's bigotry dressed up as biology. And so your internet race is saying you're not English, no matter how many. You're Spurs fan, right?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So no matter how much you claim to be a football fan, no matter how much what you sound like, or however English you feel you are, you're not English.
But I mean, can you reliably reconstruct who someone was through genetics, or can you only get likelihoods? Like, this person was, 40% likely to taste coriander like it's soap.
Yeah. Yeah. If there's one thing that I want people to recognize in all of my work, is that genetics is not deterministic, it is probabilistic. So you started by asking me about 23andMe. The gene, the brown blue-eyed gene, the version that I've got, if you look at a population, 69% of people with the version that I've got have brown eyes. Right? So that's 2/3 of people with that genotype have this phenotype. Now, of course, I know I have brown eyes because mirrors, right? I didn't need to pay for that service. But the way you just framed that question was perfect, right? Because if you dug me up in 10,000 years when my eyes color is not available, but you did manage to get the DNA sequence for that particular gene, you've got a 2 out of 3 chance that you're going to get my eye color roughly right, without counting the other genes, the green-eyed gene, the other 14 or however many genes are involved in pigmentation in the iris. So, yeah, probabilistically, you could make a decent fist at saying it's more than 50% likely that this guy had brown eyes. But you wouldn't bet the farm on that, though, would you?
I mean, then how did you feel about like the Cheddar Man reconstruction? Because obviously it was a massive news story. The reconstruction of the Cheddar Man was like, he's got dark skin and he looks like the South Asian girls who have the blue contacts, like startling. Did you look at that and you go, "Ooh, I'm not sure." I mean, was it nailed on? Do you think it's
a really accurate? Interesting case study, and it was done by colleagues and friends. So I wasn't involved in the study itself, but I was very closely involved in how it was disseminated. The scientific paper, which describes Cheddar Man and the genome sequence of Cheddar Man, is pretty circumspect, and I think gets it pretty accurately. So, with these particular genotypes, we predict that this man, will have darker skin in this sort of range, will have eye color in this sort of range, because science is it's boringly circumspect. We always have to say
you're always hedging.
There's the classic line is one of the presidents, I can't remember which one it was, when it was a scientific advisor for Roosevelt or something, says, "Can you get me a one-armed scientist?" So they can't say, "Yeah, but on the other hand," right? It's probably apocryphal. But that's what we have to do, right? Because we don't pronounce truths in science. We're always circumspect because every result is only conditionally conditionally correct. So that's what the paper says. But what people want, understandably, is not to read about the probability of whether this guy had this range of skin color or hair texture or whatever. They want to see what this guy was like. And that's the most exciting thing about this field, is that we can not just reconstruct historical events or actions, but we can see what people were like. This is a man who died 10,000 years ago in England. Somerset? Is Cheddar in Somerset?
Listen, I've never left London in my life.
I think it's Somerset. Anyway, people will be more angry about that. How can he make pronouncements when he doesn't even know where the Somerset...
It's the West Country. Cheddar's in the West Country.
Yeah, right. That's exciting. So what we often do, and what often happens, is you create a maquette or a bust and a reconstruction. And you have to make decisions in doing that where you can't be circumspect, where you can't be conditional. And so there was a choice. What pigment, this is the range. What color are we going to make this guy's skin? What color are we going to make this guy's eyes? Now, I don't think it's wrong. And it's quite possible that reconstruction was literally a mirror image of what that guy looked like. But it's also quite possible that he didn't look like that very much at all.
I mean, I want to talk about the appeal of DNA and understanding your genetic self. You know who Michael K. Williams is? Was?
Yes.
Played Omar Little.
The greatest anti-hero in all American culture.
I mean, one of my favourite bits of The Wire is when he's in the turquoise pajamas and he's on his way to the shops to get the Honey Nut Cheerios.
Omar coming.
Yeah, Omar strolling. He was approached by a kind of, DNA testing lab that markets itself specifically to African Americans. And they made a little short documentary of his experience of doing this ancestry test. And it was so emotional for him. And he calls up a friend of his who also did the test called Isaiah Washington. And it just so happens that they both could trace some heritage back to a particular tribe in Senegal. And it is undoubtedly just this powerful moment. And they're both crying. They're both saying, I knew we were brothers. And I found myself feeling quite uncomfortable about it because on the one hand, this is so clearly important to them. And who am I to say this is a load of horseshit? But on the other, I found something, when you look at how it's sort of measured, it's like, 1 out of 32 ancestors. I was like, but this is as much of a story as the one African Americans had to create for themselves after the displacement and the trauma and the huge cultural, psychological, political break that was the experience of slavery.
Yeah. I write about this in one of my books, How to Argue with a Racist, because I think it is incredibly hard to process this. I think it's exploitation. The fact that some of those companies are owned by African Americans doesn't make this an easier conversation. The desire for narrative satisfaction, I think, is the main fuel for all of these ancestry companies, not just the ones targeting the African American descendants of the enslaved experience.
As African American, are you African? Oh, hell no, I ain't African. You're not wrong though. They're not wrong though. You're not wrong. I ain't African. You're not wrong though. They're not wrong though. You're not wrong. Are they right? But it's just the reaction. Okay. True. Now, and I could be a little sensitive because of how I grew up. Okay, hold up. Here's okay. But this is going to answer that question. So, the history of African Americans in America does not necessarily work in their favor based on everything that was logged. As you see all the movies, 12 Years a Slave, it's a constant reminder that, hey, African Americans, this is your story in America. When I was in Nigeria, I did not know of the African American story until I got to America and found out. That's true. Right? I did not know anything about slavery. When I was in Nigeria, I did not know of the African American story until I got to America and found out. That's true. Right? I did not know anything about slavery.
I'm going to do missionary work. Probably be going to Africa. I'll be doing work among your people. Not mine. My people in St. Louis.